She was pouring his black coffee when the glass rim rattled against the heavy ceramic mug. For a fraction of a second, the entire afternoon seemed to freeze inside the long, narrow room. The overhead fan kept up its lazy, rhythmic click against the water-stained ceiling tiles. The old jukebox in the corner hummed a low-country track from some forgotten decade, and a lone mechanic at the counter kept his eyes fixed entirely on his plate, pretending the sudden stillness didn't exist. Her gaze drifted from the dark liquid, rising to the brim up to the giant, heavily calloused hand resting flat against the laminate tabletop. On the thick wrist of the stranger sat a faded, stretched-out blue rubber band with the words printed in white block letters, mostly rubbed away by years of sweat and motion. "I promise." Because she was the one who had stood in a gravel lot 32 years ago in Akron, Ohio, watching a skinny kid with oversized sneakers wear that exact same phrase like a shield against the world. The coffee pot trembled violently. Maya pulled it back, setting it down with a sharp, metallic clink on the stainless steel tray before her fingers lost their grip entirely. The man did not look up immediately. He kept his head tilted down, the dark brim of his worn canvas ball cap casting a heavy shadow across his nose and jawline. He was a mountain of a man, easily 6 feet 9 inches, his broad shoulders stretching the seams of a plain, unbranded charcoal hoodie. He looked like someone who had spent his entire life absorbing the gravity of massive spaces. Yet here he sat, folded carefully into a cracked red vinyl booth at the back corner of the high desert Oasis Diner, a small town called Blue Ridge, Nevada, a place where people only stopped when their engines overheated or their spirits gave out. And he was certainly not supposed to be sitting here, looking at the scarred surface of the table like he already knew the exact weight of the air she was breathing. LeBron James took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee and let his eyes track the heat waves rising off the highway outside. He had seen the exact microsecond of recognition fracture her expression the moment she stepped within 3 feet of his booth. He had felt it in the subtle shift of her weight, the way her breathing caught in her throat, shifting from the automatic rhythm of a waitress on hour 8 of a double shift to the sharp, ragged gasp of someone who had just looked into a mirror from another lifetime. He could have spoken her name right then. Maya. 2 short syllables, spoken in his deep, unmistakable baritone, and 3 decades of distance would have evaporated into a single, clean breath. But the rigid, defensive posture of her shoulders told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had transpired in those 32 intervening years, it was pressing down on her right now, heavier than the commercial tray she held against her ribs. She was calculating. She was deciding if she could afford to let the world see her under this harsh, flickering fluorescent light. So he chose the silence. He had driven out into the vast, empty stretches of the Nevada desert for this exact purpose, to find a corner where the noise of the world couldn't follow. It had been an exhausting 11 months, a brutal, relentless season followed by a corporate press tour that had left him feeling less like a living, breathing human being and more like a high-end commercial asset someone forgot to turn off at night. When the final mandatory interview concluded in Las Vegas, he didn't call the driver. He didn't board the private jet. He simply took the keys to an old, unbadged pickup truck from his security detail, picked a direction on the compass where the lights grew thin, and drove. He had pulled off the interstate at Blue Ridge because the hand-painted sign by the exit looked like it didn't have a corporate strategy behind it. Since 1984, home-cooked, all day. The letters were slightly uneven, the work of an old man named Thomas, who had spent 30 years behind the flat-top grill, earning the dark grease stains on his apron through honest, unglamorous labor. When LeBron had walked through the door 40 minutes earlier, his massive frame blocking out the midday sun, Thomas had looked up from his hash browns. Their eyes met for a single, unblinking second. The old cook didn't gasp. He didn't reach for a phone. He simply gave the giant a microscopic nod a silent universal code between men who understood what it meant to carry a heavy load, and went back to scraping the iron grill. But Maya had not returned to the back booth. She moved along the counter with a stiff, guarded efficiency, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, refilling sugar dispensers, passing within arm's reach of him without ever letting her eyes drift below his chin. LeBron watched her move across the linoleum floor and noted the faint, unmistakable hitch in her stride. Her right leg moved with a deliberate, calculated effort. One step solid, the next just a fraction of a second slower, a rhythmic reminder of an old, deep trauma that her body had long since accepted as part of its daily rent. Twice, her eyes caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The second time, her lower jaw set into a hard, rigid line. He watched her approach, a younger waitress near the kitchen hatch, her hands moving in a brief, pleading gesture, asking if they could trade sections for the remainder of the afternoon. The younger girl, her face flushed with the stress of 4 busy tables, shook her head quickly, without looking up from her order pad. Maya didn't argue. She closed her eyes for 3 long seconds, drew a breath that squared her spine, and walked straight back toward the fire. Thomas slid a heavy ceramic plate under the hot pass behind her. Thick ham steak, 3 over-easy eggs, and a mound of unseasoned potatoes. Maya picked it up with a hand that had stopped shaking, though the skin across her knuckles was pulled tight and bloodless. She set the plate down in front of him with the practiced gentleness of a professional. "Thomas said you looked like you had a long road behind you," she said. Her voice leveled out into a flat, neutral hospitality tone that completely denied the existence of Akron, Ohio. "On the house. That's real kind of him," LeBron replied, his voice low, dropping the pitch so it stayed strictly between the 2 walls of the booth. "And kind of you." As he looked up to meet her gaze, the harsh desert light cut underneath the brim of his cap, illuminating the deep, familiar lines around his eyes and the unmistakable composure of his face. The small check holder in Maya's hand clicked against the metal edge of the table. She stood entirely motionless, her breathing suspended, and for 5 seconds, the professional mask she had spent years building in this desert town cracked straight down the middle. She didn't ask for permission. She simply slid into the vinyl seat directly opposite him, her back to the rest of the diner, shielding him from the room with her own shadow. For a long time, neither of them said a word. A massive double-trailer semi roared past on the highway outside, its engine braking rattling the glass panes in their frames. The small radio behind the cash registers switched to a dry, monotonous agricultural report for Elko County. "You let me stand there," she whispered finally, her voice raw, stripped of all waitress armor. "You sat there for 40 minutes, letting me pretend you were just another trucker passing through. I thought you needed the time," LeBron said softly, his massive hands folded neatly on either side of his plate. "I saw how you looked when I walked in. I knew if I said your name too fast, you might have walked right out that back door. So I gave you the space." Maya shook her head, a short, bitter movement that was half a laugh and half a defense against the sting in her eyes. 32 years, LeBron. 32 years since we sat on the curb on Cedar Street, watching the rain fill up the potholes. And I find you sitting in a $70 hoodie in the middle of nowhere, watching me limp around a diner. She reached up, her fingers tightening around the faded fabric of her apron, gesturing faintly at the grease on her sleeve, the cracked flooring, the entire modest perimeter of her existence. "I'm not the person we talked about becoming." "You're exactly her," LeBron said, his eyes locking onto hers with an absolute steady intensity that refused to let her look away. "You just have a few more miles on you. We both do." She looked out the window, her fingers tracing a small scratch in the formica. "Why here, really? There are 1,000 miles of highway between LA and where you belong. I just needed a road where nobody was asking me to be anything but a guy driving a truck," he said. "I didn't know this place was here. I just saw the sign." Maya let out a long, ragged breath, she seemed to have been holding since the turn of the decade. Her eyes flicked involuntarily toward a small, framed photograph pinned behind the cash register. A picture of a young girl with bright eyes holding a cheap plastic basketball. Then she looked back at him, her face hardening with a sudden, pragmatic reality. "I have to get back to my tables. Don't leave yet." "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and that was the exact moment the voice cut through from 3 booths over. It wasn't a shout, but it possessed that peculiar, heavy arrogance designed to ensure everyone in a quiet room knew exactly who owned the air. "Well now," the voice drawled, heavy with the self-satisfied weight of local importance. "I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me when you pulled that old Chevy up to the pump." LeBron adjusted the brim of his cap slightly, his eyes remaining calm as the sound of the heavy footsteps neared his booth. But before the interruption could breach their space, Maya gave him a warning look, a silent plea that asked him to remain a ghost just a little longer. She slid out of the booth swiftly, her movements sharp despite the persistent hitch in her right leg, and intercepted the man before he could reach the table. LeBron watched her back as she guided the customer away. He didn't look at the man. Instead, his mind drifted down the long gray corridors of memory, back to a place where the air tasted like sulfur and coal dust, and the winters never seemed to end. Akron, Ohio, 1994. To the rest of the world, that city was just a dot on a map of the Rust Belt, a place of abandoned rubber factories and cracked asphalt. But to LeBron and Maya, it was the entire universe. They had lived 3 houses apart on a street where the streetlights only worked half the time. Maya's mother, a soft-spoken woman who taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, had been the only adult on the block who didn't look at the neighborhood children with suspicion. When LeBron's mother had to work consecutive double shifts at the nursing home across town, it was Maya's mother who would leave an extra plastic bowl of chicken noodle soup on the porch steps. And it was Maya who would sit on those freezing concrete steps with him, sharing a single pair of oversized winter gloves. He took the right, she took the left, while they watched the gray slush pile up in the potholes of Cedar Street. They were 15 when the promise was made. It was a stifling August night, the kind where the humidity made it feel like you were breathing underwater. They had walked down to the public park, sitting beneath a rusted basketball hoop that didn't even have a net. LeBron's sneakers were second-hand, the soles held together by 2 thick strips of black electrical tape. The other kids had spent the afternoon mocking the way his accent sounded, the way his clothes smelled of the laundromat basement. Maya had sat beside him on the cracked curb, holding a paperback book she had borrowed from her mother's classroom. She had looked at him with that absolute, unyielding certainty that only a teenager from a broken neighborhood could possess. "We are going to leave this place," she had said, her voice small but heavy with intent. "We are going to become people who are not defined by the number of times the landlord changes the locks. You're going to play in those big arenas, LeBron. And I'm going to have my own classroom with 32 desks and a window that looks out at trees, not brick walls. We're going to build something real." He had believed her. He had taken that certainty and carried it inside his chest like a brick through every high school gym, every grueling practice, and eventually into the bright, blinding arena lights of the NBA. He had left Akron. He had run so fast and so far that the gray streets of his childhood became nothing more than a narrative the sports commentators used to spice up a pre-game broadcast. And now, 32 years later, he was a global icon. His name was a corporate entity. His face was plastered across 7-story billboards in Tokyo and New York. He lived in a house with 20-foot ceilings and automated security gates, where the air was filtered to specific, clean temperature, completely devoid of the smell of grease and burnt onions. He had achieved the dream they had drawn on that cracked curb. But as he looked across the narrow diner, he saw the distance that the dream had created. Maya was still here. Not in Akron, but in another version of it, buried deep in the high desert of Nevada. She was 47 years old, her hair pulled back into a tight, efficient ponytail that couldn't hide the silver strands at her temples. The girl who used to read poetry on the porch steps was now calculating the price of a ham steak, her fingers stained with blue ink from a cheap ballpoint pen, her spine stiffening every time a customer cleared their throat. The contrast was a physical weight in the room. LeBron thought about the 3 championship rings, sitting in a velvet-lined safe in Los Angeles, the millions of dollars flowing through automated accounts while he slept, the sheer velocity of his life. And then he looked at the white line across Maya's knuckle as she wiped down a neighboring counter. Her life hadn't moved with velocity. It had been ground down by the slow, relentless friction of survival. He watched her clear a plate from table 4. Every time she stepped on her right foot, her weight shifted awkwardly, a subtle tilt of her hip that spoke of bones that hadn't healed quite right. It wasn't the limp of an old person. It was the limp of someone who had been broken in the middle of her life and had to learn how to keep moving before the cast was even dry. Behind the cash register, among the faded postcards of the Grand Canyon and the dusty plastic flowers, LeBron's eyes found the small crayon drawing again. It was a horse, drawn with heavy, determined strokes of a brown saps crayon. In the lower right corner, the block letters read, Delphine, Grade 4. A child's drawing. The same kind of drawing Maya's mother used to pin to the corkboard in Akron. The cycle had continued, but the geography had changed. The small town of Blue Ridge hadn't been a destination for Maya. It was a hiding place, a place where the bills couldn't find her quite as fast, where she could disappear into the background noise of truck engines and highway static. LeBron felt a cold, familiar anger tightening in his chest. It wasn't the explosive anger of the basketball court. It was the quiet, heavy anger he had felt as a boy, when he saw his mother crying over a utility bill at the kitchen table. The world loved a story about a kid who made it out of the mud. The world built statues for the ones who ran fast enough to escape. But the world was completely indifferent to the ones who stayed in the mud, the ones who fought just as hard but were tripped by a rogue stone along the way. Maya walked past his booth again, her head down, her tray held high. She didn't look at him, but as she passed, she dropped a fresh napkin onto the table. Written on the edge in faint, hurried pencil lines was a single phrase. He is still looking at you. Be careful. LeBron didn't look up to find the man she was warning him about. He didn't need to. He simply reached out, picked up the paper napkin, and folded it carefully into a small, tight square, tucking it into the front pocket of his hoodie. He had spent 20 years dealing with men who thought they owned the room. He knew exactly how to wait. The heavy leather boots clicked sharply against the linoleum floor, stopping right at the edge of the booth, 3 spaces away. Vance Sterling did not sit down immediately. He stood leaning against the high back of the vinyl seat, his posture deliberately expansive, ensuring his presence dominated the narrow corridor of the diner. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair styled with expensive precision, wearing a tailored Western shirt with polished pearl snaps, a heavy gold Rolex that caught the harsh fluorescent light, and a bolo tie featuring a piece of turquoise the size of a fist. He looked like a man who spent his entire life making sure everyone in the room knew his net worth before he even opened his mouth. Across from him, a younger man in a dusty baseball cap sat with the rigid, uncomfortable posture of an employee who had learned through long experience that his boss enjoyed making a scene in public. "Maya," Vance called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the old refrigerator with a practiced, casual authority. "Bring us a fresh pot, and make sure it's actually hot this time. I don't pay the lease on this building to drink yesterday's dishwater." Maya's shoulders stiffened. She stopped wiping the counter, her fingers tightening around the damp cloth until her knuckles turned a bloodless white. She didn't look at LeBron. She didn't look at anyone. She simply rinsed the cloth in the metal sink, took a fresh glass café from the warmer, and walked toward Vance's table with that measured, calculated step that tried to hide the deep ache in her right thigh. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping into that flat, professional customer service tone she used like armor. "Regular or decaf?" "Regular." "And don't skimp on the cream," Vance said, not looking at her as he pulled a thick leather planner out of his briefcase. He waited until the dark liquid reached the rim of his cup, then reached out and tapped the edge of the table with a manicured finger. "I saw the report from the county clerk this morning, Maya. Your late fee on the residential extension was due by 5 o'clock yesterday. The system flagged it at 5:01. Maya set the pot down carefully, her hand hovering over the handle for a fraction of a second. "I spoke with the office last week, Mr. Sterling. The check from the school district aid application hasn't cleared yet. They promised me a 5-day grace period because of the holiday." Vance let out a short, dry laugh, a sound entirely devoid of humor. He leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms over his chest, looking up at her with the cold, self-righteous satisfaction of a man who viewed human lives as line items on a spreadsheet. "The office doesn't grant extensions, Maya. The protocol is the protocol. It's right there in paragraph 14 of the Standard Occupancy Agreement. We don't manage portfolios based on promises. We manage them based on compliance. If you can't meet the baseline standard for the property, the system automatically triggers the next phase of the recovery cycle. That's just optimal asset management." The diner had gone completely silent. Even Thomas behind the flat-top grill had stopped scraping the iron, his spatula held inches above the grease, his gray eyes fixed on Vance's back. Maya stood very still, her tray held flat against her stomach. "My daughter has school in this district, Mr. Sterling. I've paid the rent on time for 3 years. I just need 48 hours for the processing deposit to clear. And that's the problem with your demographic," Vance said, his voice rising slightly, ensuring the 3 other truckers at the counter could hear his philosophy. He picked up the printed notice from his planner and flicked it with the back of his hand, letting the paper flutter onto the floor right next to Maya's scuffed orthopedic shoe. "It's always a cycle. You make a bad choice, you get behind, and then you expect the corporate structure to adjust its metrics for your personal drama. Some families just don't have the discipline to climb out of the mud. Your mother spent her last years burning through state subsidies. You're waiting tables with a broken leg egg. And that little girl of yours is running around the parking lot in shoes, held together by grocery string. It's a generational pattern, Maya. The math doesn't lie." A sharp, violent crack shattered the silence. It wasn't a shout. It was the sound of LeBron's heavy ceramic coffee mug being set down against the Formica tabletop with the precise, controlled force of a hammer striking an anvil. LeBron stood up slowly. The movement seemed to take an eternity. His massive 6'9" frame uncoiled from the cramped red vinyl booth, rising higher and higher until his shadow literally blotted out the light from the front window, covering Vance Sterling's table in complete darkness. The charcoal hoodie stretched tight across his massive shoulders. He didn't rush. He stepped into the center aisle, his heavy boots making no sound on the linoleum, and walked until he stood exactly 3 inches from the edge of Vance's booth. Vance looked up, the arrogant smirk on his face freezing instantly as he found himself staring directly at the massive, unyielding chest of a man who looked like he could lift the entire diner off its foundation. The silver mustache on Vance's lip twitched, his hand moving automatically to cover his gold watch. "Sir," LeBron said, his baritone voice incredibly low, dropping to a frequency that vibrated right through the floorboards. There was no heat in it. There was no theatrical anger. It was the cold, terrifying authority of a man who had commanded the largest rooms in the world for 2 decades. "I think you're speaking about things you haven't lived." Vance swallowed hard, his face turning a sudden, sharp shade of crimson as he tried to find his legalistic footing. "Now, look here, buddy. This is a private business matter. I own the commercial lease on this entire block. The regulations state I don't care about your regulations, sir, LeBron interrupted, his dark eyes locking onto Vance's, with a gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the developer's chest. I know men who work two jobs. I know women who raise children by themselves, who spend every single hour of the day doing the absolute best they can with what they have. Calling that a lack of discipline, calling that a generational pattern in a room where a child's drawing is on the wall, tells me everything I need to know about your math. It's cheap, and it's small. Vance's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked around the diner, desperate to find an ally, but the mechanic at the counter had turned his stool around, staring at him with a cold, disgusted glare. Thomas behind the grill was leaning forward, his large arms crossed over his chest, nodding slowly. LeBron didn't offer a defense. He didn't give a speech. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of human dignity, waiting for the developer to make a choice. Vance's face went through three distinct colors, shifting from a dark red to a deep, bruised purple along the line of his jaw. He slammed his leather planner shut, his fingers trembling so hard he missed the clasp twice. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and threw it violently onto the table before grabbing his briefcase and shoving past his employee. The bell above the door jangled with a frantic, metallic panic as Vance stormed out into the desert heat, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind him. The dust from Vance Sterling's sudden departure had barely settled on the gravel lot before LeBron picked up his phone. He did not call a publicist, and he did not make a post on social media. He dialed a direct, 10-digit number that bypassed every assistant and corporate gatekeeper in his organization. Marcus Vance, a senior corporate compliance attorney based out of San Francisco who had managed LeBron's private real estate investments for 14 years, answered on the second ring. LeBron kept his voice low, his words sparse but absolute. He didn't ask for a favor, he issued a directive. He gave Marcus the name of Vance Sterling, the property holding company listed on the bottom of the crumpled eviction notice, and the exact coordinates of Blue Ridge, Nevada. Look into the municipal housing leases, LeBron said, his eyes tracking a solitary ant crawling across the sun-bleached windowsill. Check the late fee structures against the state cap. Look at the local public school employment records for the last 3 years. Find out how many residential units this holding group has reclaimed under paragraph 14 since 2023. I want the full architecture of the operation on my desk by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. By Thursday afternoon, the counter at the High Desert Oasis Diner had become an informal war room, though no one walking in from the highway would have noticed. LeBron sat in the exact same back booth, a fresh stack of bound legal documents wrapped in heavy brown cardstock resting beside his saucer. Across from him sat 3 local residents who had lived in the shadow of Vance Sterling's optimal asset management for years. There was Arthur Collins, a 61-year-old diesel mechanic whose hands were permanently stained with black engine oil. He laid a yellowed piece of carbon paper on the table, a predatory maintenance ledger showing he had been charged $4,200 for a roof repair that was never executed, forcing his small garage into a technical default that Vance's company used to seize the land. Next to him was Clara Higgins, a retired county clerk who had kept precise, handwritten logs of every municipal housing transaction in the district. She presented a ledger detailing 43 instances where single mothers had been assessed late fees that exceeded the Nevada state legal limit by exactly 22%, all processed through an automated system designed to trigger evictions before the tenants could access legal aid. The third was a young man named David, a former accountant for Sterling Developments, who had been fired 6 months earlier for refusing to sign off on a tax depreciation schedule that erased the value of low-income units to force municipal condemnation. The data was cold, precise, and unyielding. It was the exact kind of math Vance Sterling worshipped, but it had been turned into a weapon against him. At 4:15 on Friday afternoon, the bell above the door jangled with its usual metallic sharpness. Vance Sterling walked in, flanked by two corporate lawyers carrying identical leather briefcases. Vance had spent the last 24 hours receiving frantic calls from his primary lenders in Reno, who had suddenly informed him that his commercial credit lines were being frozen due to an unexpected, comprehensive audit initiated by a major institutional investor. He had come to the diner to find the giant, who had broken his peace, his face tight, his silver mustache twitching with a mixture of defensive arrogance and rising panic. "You think because you have a name, you can come into my county and interfere with my commercial assets," Vance said. Stopping at the edge of the booth, his voice shaking slightly, despite his best efforts to maintain his judicial posture. "My legal team has already drafted a cease and desist. We have standard compliance records for every single property in the Blue Ridge District. You have no standing here." LeBron did not stand up this time. He remained seated, his massive hands flat on the table, looking up at the developer with a calm, clinical indifference that made the two lawyers behind Vance shift their feet uncomfortably. He slid the thick brown folder across the Formica tabletop until it clicked against Vance's gold signet ring. "Open it, Vance," LeBron said softly. The senior lawyer behind Vance reached out, unclasped the folder, and scanned the first 3 pages. Within 30 seconds, the lawyer's face went entirely pale, the professional composure draining from his eyes. He leaned down and whispered into Vance's ear, his voice urgent and strained. "It's a systemic forensic audit of the entire T22 holding portfolio. They didn't just check the leases. They have the internal server logs from the automated eviction triggers. They have the state tax minimum non-compliance filings. If this hits the state attorney general, the corporate shield collapses entirely. We're looking at a structural liquidation." Vance's hand dropped to the back of the vinyl seat, his knuckles turning a sharp, bloodless white as the reality of the document hit him like a physical blow. The self-righteous armor he had worn for 30 years, the prideful belief that his wealth made his cruelty legal, cracked wide open. He looked at Arthur, the mechanic he had ruined. He looked at Clara, the clerk he had ignored. And finally he looked at LeBron, whose quiet presence held the absolute weight of an entire system turning against him. "This isn't just about a late fee, is it?" Vance whispered, his voice suddenly sounding thin, stripped of all its carrying power. The red flush on his neck had turned into a mottled, bruised purple. "You're trying to destroy my entire life's work over a waitress." "No," LeBron said, his voice dropping into a deep, steady rhythm that echoed through the silent room. "I'm showing you the real cost of your rules. You spent 30 years believing that people are just metrics you can crush to optimize a balance sheet. You thought, because they were quiet, they were small. But the math doesn't lie, Vance. The system you built to crush them just ran out of road, and you're the one who has to pay the bill." Vance stood entirely frozen, his jaw working silently, his eyes staring down at the brown paper folder like it was an open grave. For the first time in his 64 years in Kern County, he had nothing left to say. He turned slowly, his boots dragging heavily against the linoleum, and walked out of the diner without looking back, his legal team following behind him in total, embarrassed silence. The legal liquidation of Sterling Developments did not make the front page of the metropolitan newspapers, but the effects reverberated through the dusty streets of Blue Ridge like a fresh rainfall after a decade of drought. Within 90 days, the county court stripped Vance Sterling's holding company of its residential operating licenses, forcing the immediate transfer of the municipal leases to a nonprofit land trust managed by Clara Higgins and Arthur Collins. The predatory late fees were legally refunded, erasing 43 separate accounts of manufactured debt. Vance himself was ordered to perform 200 hours of community restitution, finding himself carrying heavy boxes of dry goods into the very buildings he had spent 30 years trying to condemn. His face, permanently set in a quiet, shattered realization of the human lives his metrics had broken. But the real transformation happened inside the walls of the high desert oasis diner. On a brilliant Monday morning in September, Maya stood at the threshold of room 104 at Blue Ridge Elementary School. She wasn't wearing her stained grease ponytail or her heavy waitress apron. She wore a neat linen blouse, her hair falling softly around her shoulders, and in her hands she carried a brand new leather folder containing her restored teaching credentials. Ramona Pritchard, the principal, stood by the water cooler, her black horn-rimmed glasses pushed up into her steel-gray hair, watching Maya with a sharp, approving nod as 32 second-graders scrambled into their desks. Maya sat down in a low, comfortable padded chair near the window, a chair specifically modified to support her right thigh without causing stress to the old pin in her bone. As a young boy named Marcus walked up to her desk, holding a picture book he had been afraid to read out loud for 6 months, Maya smiled. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no remaining trace of the diner's exhaustion. It was light, steady, and full of the patient warmth she had thought was buried forever in the mud of Akron. "Let's start from the beginning, Marcus," she whispered, her fingers resting gently on the page. "Take all the time you need." Back at the diner, Thomas had officially taken ownership of the property through a quiet, interest-free commercial grant structured by LeBron's foundation. The old sign outside received a fresh coat of paint from Thomas's own hand, with a new line added beneath the original letters: Blue Ridge Community Kitchen. A long oak communal table replaced the broken front booths, featuring a 3-tier shelf filled with donated books. By the cash register, a new chalkboard carried a message, written in Thomas's careful block lettering. "If you are hungry and cannot pay today, speak with the kitchen. There is always a way." In October, on a Tuesday afternoon exactly 14 months after his first visit, the faded pickup truck pulled back into the gravel lot of the diner. LeBron James stepped out into the crisp autumn air, wearing the same unbranded charcoal hoodie, his canvas ball cap pulled low over his eyes. The town had changed. The air smelled of Thomas's slow-simmered vegetable soup instead of exhaust fumes, and the gravel lot was clean of broken glass. When he walked through the door, the bell jangled softly. Maya looked up from the communal table where she was helping a local mother fill out a nursing school application. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, her stride smoother now, the heavy limp reduced to a faint, graceful rhythm, and walked across the room. She reached out, took his ball cap gently off his head, and hung it on the wooden hook by the entrance. "Our coffee is still terrible, LeBron," she said, a full, beautiful smile illuminating her face. "I drove 400 miles for it," LeBron replied, his deep voice carrying a soft, genuine warmth. "Put a cup on my bill." They sat in his old booth in the back corner. Maya brought over 2 mugs, sliding into the seat opposite him without asking. "The anonymous packages of books still arrive every 3 weeks," she said, looking down at her hands, which were now smooth and free of ink stains. "Delphine has read every single one of them. Twice. And the scholarship for her art class in Reno." The advisor said it was funded by an anonymous reader who believes children should never run out of paper. LeBron took a slow sip of the coffee, looking out the window at the mountains turning the color of copper in the late afternoon sun. "I don't know anything about any advisors, Maya. I just stop here because the sign looks honest." "I know," she said, her eyes misty but her face entirely serene. "You told me before you left that you don't believe in rescues because they make the rescuer feel big and the other person feel small. I didn't truly understand it then. But looking at this room now, looking at the women who come in here to study, looking at my daughter, I get it. You didn't lift us out of the mud, LeBron. You just reminded us that we had feet to walk out ourselves. You always had the strength, Maya," LeBron said softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with absolute respect. "You just needed someone to stop the clock for a second so you could find your footing. That's not a rescue. That's just recognizing another human being. Delphine came out of the back pantry then, 14 years old now, taller than before, her long brown hair brushed neatly. She froze when she saw the giant in the booth, her face lighting up with a sudden, brilliant grin. She didn't ask for permission. She simply slid into the booth right next to her mother, holding a heavy hardback volume about wild horses. "You're back," the girl said. "I'm back," LeBron smiled. "My mom says someone has been changing this town from a distance," Delphine said, her eyes searching his face with that complete seriousness only teenagers can manage. "She says there are people like Vance Sterling who build fences and people who open doors. She asked me which one I wanted to be." LeBron set his mug down carefully on the saucer, his face growing thoughtful as he looked at the young girl. "And what did you tell her, Delphine?" "I told her I already knew," she said quietly. LeBron nodded slowly, a deep, satisfied expression settling into the lines of his face. "That's the best answer you could ever give." They talked for another hour, the three of them, about school, about the books, about the winters in Ohio, until the shadows of the overhead fans grew long against the back wall. Then LeBron stood up, his massive frame reaching the ceiling tiles one last time. He reached into his pocket, tucked a clean $20 bill underneath his saucer, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back. He saw Thomas through the kitchen window, waving a metal ladle with a wide, silent grin. He saw the shelf of books, the oak table filled with neighbors sharing a meal, and he saw Maya and her daughter sitting together in the warm afternoon light, safe within the perimeter of a life they had fought to reclaim. He stepped out into the gravel lot, started his truck on the very first try, and drove east toward the open desert, his taillights fading into the twilight as the hills turned the color of old gold, leaving behind a town that had finally learned how to remember its own worth.